right. All right. Good morning. Well, not good morning. What? Good evening, guys. So today, yeah, I'm gonna talk about something spicy. I'm gonna talk about the violence of dialectical dialectics and the violence also with process philosophy. Now, this may or may not bode well with a lot of people, but I feel like there is something to this these kinds of ways of thinking. Um, so what's interesting about like dialectics, like Hegelian systems and process philosophy, what's very interesting about these kind of logics is that they incorporate the opposite. They have a tendency to incorporate the opposite of itself. And even though incorporating the opposite is beneficial to say that you have a more robust logic, this robust logic also escapes or tends to escape um, any any attempt at criticism. Um, so, for example, right, a very common humorous Hegelian thing among Hegelians is that the moment that you're against Hegel, you're with Hegel, right? You sort of already participate in the system. And, I have another example where it's like in Jonathan Haidt's kind of moral definition and philosophy is that because everything is predicated on intuition and on rationality. Now, I'm not trying to promote rationality, but here's where Haidt gets us, right? Haidt basically says, well, if you don't believe in my system, then I just failed to appeal to your intuition, right? So the moment he says this word, that I failed to appeal to your intuition, you're already playing, you've already fallen into his system, basically. And the same thing with the Hegelian notion, right? Like any critique almost becomes evaded because it's incorporated, right? It's a part of itself, right? It's a part of the world historical process. Um, and so that's one thing that is somewhat problematic in my opinion, because what ends up happening is like it becomes this impenetrable shell for thinking to occur, right? Like you're allowed, you can play with this system, and it prevents you from it prevents any real critique. Basically, the only critiques that you face within these type of systems are the people that are thinking within those systems, right? Or thinking within those logics. That's the problem. Um, they completely evade anything from the outside because they've already basically assimilated the outside. They've accounted for the outside, because the whole logic is kind of pressed on either this is a process philosophy or um, this is dialectical. So it's it's already incorporated in there. We're just waiting for the sublimation, basically. Um, but I've noticed another tendency in the sort of violence in this kind of thinking that occurs is that deep inside there's a kind of like enjoyment to it all, like enjoying that anything that sort of is posed against you can't really pose any real threat against you because of the logic that you're playing with. And then the other issue with that also, because it demands basically an inside critique, like you have to go and so the reason why I'm talking about these kind of logics is because one, they make void attacking it from the outside, right? So the only way to attack these systems is from the inside. Now, that seems uh, that seems good and all. However, you have to like basically it forces your hand to participate in the logic. And of course, there's always this other debate where it's like if you do try to play with the logic and then try to undermine it, people will say something like, "Oh, but you don't understand Hegel," or like, "You don't understand, so and so." Right? So there always seems to be this extra step someone should do to understand the philosophy. There's always this extra condition that is sort of thrown that can't dismiss the philosophy. Um, and of course, there's also the announcement of their experience, right, and the culmination of the time they spent working on this idea and working on a product, right? I mean, I sometimes I can't help but look at some of the things that are said, some of the philosophical conversations that are had. I can't help but be suspicious of the fact that what is being defended is the very assault on one's own thinking, right? And the moment that we can find a system that sort of does this ironic contradiction where it's like, oh, even if you're against me, you're with me, or even if you're against me, you prove my point, right? This sort of opposites, this sort of play with thinking, um, it provides a sort of self-defense mechanism. It's like you could say it's like the supreme self mechanism. It's like the supreme like self assertion of like feeling comfortable, right? And what's ironic about this is like, sure, their system may say something like nothing's really certain, but they're certain about the system because the system is the methodology that allows that kind of play, right? So dialectics, for example, may say that everything is a notion, so we're constantly going through the constant historical world process, right? And so in that sense, we don't really have a gauge on the kind of certainty because we always know that what is knowledge will just end up being a notion, and then we encounter another concrete thing, and then that's a notion, then we encounter another concrete thing, and so on. And we're supposedly getting closer to something more concrete. Now, I'm just using Hegel as an example because it's a big example and a very common example. It's not to say people don't other do this with other philosophies; they absolutely do. But Hegel is absolutely the biggest example and the most common example. Um, and so when we consider about these philosophies, we can say like, well, you know, this is a natural consequence of trying to really think general, right? General as such. Now, I don't disagree. I don't disagree with that intention, but I do feel like there is a kind of enjoyment, and there is a kind of specifically a kind of Hegelian enjoyment. Um, there is definitely and absolutely a Hegelian enjoyment that is happening and is going on. There's also Lacanian enjoyment, um, and a sort of Zizekian enjoyment, right? These are the most three popular thinkers right now, in terms of the online presence. In terms of online presence, the people that revolve around these thinkers are very much numerous, numerous in general. Um, but the reason why a lot of these things, and even though people can say, that explains things better, is that they have very robust logics that basically incorporates within itself the critique. So that means it's impenetrable to any outside critique. It's got a soft inside, right? The logics has a soft inside because you have to choose to participate in that logic. Of course, it comes at a big cost to participate in those logics. Lacan, Zizek, Hegel, all those things, to participate in that logic, even if you have the intention to undermine it, um, requires all of your time, right? You'd have to dedicate your time, right? You'd have to prove to the other Hegelians, the other Zizekians, the other Lacanians, that you're going to dedicate your time to spending a lot of time with this text. Um, and that is actually the biggest problem, because one, right, it's such a guarded logic that if you were to have any conversation, it's going to get dismissed because one, you didn't spend enough time. You didn't read Hegel. You didn't spend enough time reading Hegel, right? And then two, if you do want to spend time in that logic, either you convert, right? You convert into accepting the logic, or you simply still lose because everybody else will tell you that the logic, you don't understand it. Basically, like, you don't understand it. You're reading it wrong, right? You're reading it wrong. Um, but I would say every time there's a sort of defense against this, there is a kind of like enjoyment that is happening from this very act, right? Because I thought about this. I mean, it's not that we're just defending ideas. We're defending uh, years of work, right? Years of work that either you or me been thinking about constantly, right? So of course you want to defend it, right? And that's the part that I was thinking about more. It was like, what does it say if we don't defend it? What does it say? And what does it say if we do defend it? Um, but strictly philosophy, I feel like that is something that, I don't know. I feel like that should have thought over, um, that should give thought, you know, about why, um, because for example, I don't. It's complicated with philosophy for sure because obviously a lot of the thinkers here would look at philosophy being sort of permeated through everything. Um, but what I'm trying to get at is that ultimately, a lot of these systems are alienating for those that are maybe disagree with the logic, right? But it basically it's a laughable disagreement because you didn't spend enough time on that logic, right? You didn't think as much as I have with it, and you didn't spend enough time with it as I have. You see, like the subtle pride elements in this sort of understanding. Um, there's a lot of pride in this thinking. And I think to me, those philosophies, specifically dialectics and process philosophies, those are the most dangerous ones for um, the virtue of thinking, in my opinion. Those are the most dangerous ones. But because you cannot discern between um, a more honest thinking and a dishonest thinking. You can't discern it. Maybe in a more closed system you can possibly, and maybe that was the benefit. But in these open systems of thinking or open philosophies, right? They're not closed in any way. Um, they don't allow for this. You wouldn't be able to tell. So it makes it more difficult to tell whether somebody is defending their intent, basically, because they want to continue to enjoy. And then also the demand and the condition is too great for people that are just not interested, right? And for some reason, I think we forget this interaction with, like, philosophers, for some reason, have this idea. It's like, well, you need to read this to understand my thinking, and then you need to read this, da 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 da. If you're serious about thinking, um, yeah, I again, to me, this is like the most uh, unrealistic and just not. It tries to set up a kind of interaction that is just not real. Like I don't want to give philosophy that pleasure of dictating what should be read to encounter a thinking, to encounter a thinker, to encounter a philosophy, to even critique a logic, or anything like that. Because in reality, with real people, and when we're dealing with real people, um, it's not like that, right? You can't tell a guy to just read Kant's Critique of Reason. You can't just tell a guy to read Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. You can't just tell a guy to just read your work so you can understand it, right? Because most average people would be like, look, if you don't explain it to me right now, then then I don't care. Right? But like we don't promote those tensions really. Like I feel like we don't promote those tensions. Everything is supposed to be a little subtle attack on like um your thinking, right? It's supposed to be an attack on your thinking and your lack of effort and your lack of impatience, or actually, in fact, your lack of patience to want to spend time and really cherish a thinker. But the thing is, and this is what has always kind of amazed me a little bit, it's like uh, I enjoy different thinkers for a variety of reasons. Now, I'm impressed that I've gotten people to read Martin Buber as much as I have, but I definitely haven't, I definitely haven't like shove that down people's throat. Obviously, I can't stop talking about it. Working on it, working on it. But Martin Buber has also one of those systems too, a little bit, right? Um, but what I like about Buber in the end is like, in the end, it's about dialogue. It's just about dialogue in the end. It's not anything. It's not really anything malicious as sorts, and you know, and for me, like Buber isn't so much of a like. There's so many missing elements that you can still think with Buber that's like good. Um, but it seems like with people like Hegel, it's like, well, you got to take the whole thing with you basically, and then you add on with it and play with it, and whatever. But yeah, with like Buber, it's like the most grounding thing for me, because it's just dialogue, But like, it's not dialogue. Obviously, it's not dialogue in the sense that we're thinking. Buber adds a twist to that. It's like this rare, kind of very special kind of dialogue where we see each other as each other, and that right there, that seeing each other as other, is like where I feel like the dialectics and the process philosophy is most dangerous, because they risk refusing the other. Like they risk it, right? But they say, right, you might say like, no, that's not what happens. But no, I mean, in my opinion, it does risk refusing the other, because it decides to, at least in Hegelian philosophy, it decides to get to what is more concrete. Um, and even going against that system is like, you basically invalidate the other by saying like, oh, yeah, it's already part of the system, right? It's already part of the system. And so I can see why Buber hated um, Hegel's historical like process, because fundamentally it didn't allow for meaning to occur. It wasn't taking this seriously. The way Buber interpreted it, it was like God unfolding in time, which was just like ridiculous to him. Um, but I'm always intrigued by Hegel critiques, because they're more offhanded than I expect them to be. So I don't take them all serious, but I mean, I'm always shocked, because I'm like, well, that's a lot of, yeah, I don't know. But it's mainly because of the way I've heard other Hegelians speak about Hegel, and so on. But I guess that's like a different, context of time. Everybody's, all the Hegelian arguments that they're probably making has already been like overridden for years now. But yeah, so this kind of philosophical enjoyment, and how it risks the other from participating, right? It's basically either don't understand or submit to spending a lot of time with this thinker. Basically, that's like what it comes down to, right? Like, would you tell a guy to spend all of time reading Plato? You'd be like, yeah, I mean, it's good to know the basics, right? Like, know a little bit of mimetic theory, and what is justice. Um, but fundamentally, if you stay too long in there, then you'll be like a little Plato boy, right? You don't really understand. And so you see, there's these, kind of like, I swear, if a philosophy was a color, there'd be a lot of racism going on. um, but color is a philosophy. But anyways, yeah, that's mainly it. Um, but I am reminded of one of Kierkegaard's subtle critiques on systems like these, because they are so open. Kierkegaard's critique was just like, if it's so open, then you really can't make a choice because you know, it's always kind of open, so to speak. Um, so basically, he's saying that it kind of prevents you from making like a real choice, which I found really interesting for some reason because I was like, wait. You want a conclusion at the end of this, Kierkegaard? You want a conclusion? But yeah, he's like, you know, because that's how you make a choice with a conclusion. At least that's for Kierkegaard. But anyways, I'm just sharing that critique because I thought it was interesting. I was like, I've never like it sounded so immediately bizarre, but I was kind of like, well, that's an interesting take on that whole like logic. Um, but yeah, anyways, that's all I got. All right, guys, take care. Bye.